they have acted in a way that to me is irrational. And I think the United States has significantly undermined its status, at least in the Middle East. I'm not qualified to talk about the world as a whole, though I think that what's happening in the Middle East has seriously eroded the position in the Middle East of the United States in the world as a whole, but it's certainly eroded the position of the United States in the Middle East. It's weakened client governments. It's emboldened all forms of hostility to the United States and to Israel, enhanced them and fortified them in ways that can't possibly be welcome in Washington. And it has put Israel on a path that is, to my way of thinking, suicidal in terms of Zionist interests. I'm not talking about killing Palestinians or the death of Israelis. I'm talking about the project. I cannot see how what they're doing helps the project. And even if we go back to the third question and you say somehow the continuation of this settler colonial project is seen as in the interest of the elites in Washington and on Wall Street, I cannot see how encouraging them to continue with this insane war helps that project's survival. I can't see it. So I really think that this has been mismanaged, even in their terms.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited, as Jeremy said, to welcome this distinguished scholar, Dr. Rashid Khalidi. Read Jeremy's comments. So Dr. Khalidi's book, as Jeremy described, details the history of Zionism in Palestine from a Palestinian perspective. Dr. Khalidi, you give a historical account, but also a first-person one as a professor of modern Arab studies whose family played significant roles in Palestinian political and cultural life while this 100 Years War unfolded. So New York City DSA had a recent reading group of 100 Years War in Palestine, something we strongly recommend others do. So many of the questions that we have for Dr. Khalidi come out of that reading group. And we just want to say that as part of an activist organization, our questions concern how lessons learned from this history might be put into action for the support of Palestine. And Dr. Khalidi is going to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll go to a brief discussion, and then we'll go to audience Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Carrington. Thanks to the DSA and everybody who made this event possible. Thanks to all of you for coming. I want to talk a little bit about the book, why I think the book is actually important to understanding where we are today. I'm a historian by training. I really do believe that you don't understand anything about where you are unless you understand where you're coming from and how you got there. That doesn't tell us where we're necessarily going, and that's maybe what we'll be getting into in the discussion, how we can get to a different place. But that's not what the book is about, and that's not what history tells you. History tells you where you are and how you got there. I wrote this book because everything I had written up to that point, the books that were just mentioned, were mainly addressed to an academic audience, sort of people who knew a lot, or something at least, about Palestine. And people like my son, much more militant than I am, and much more connected than I am, and obviously much younger than I am, kept saying to me, you know, you've got to write something for normal people, ordinary people, not just a bunch of boring academics, the kind of people you usually are writing for. And he was not the only person telling me that. My wife, one of my cousins kept saying to me, write a book for a general readership. And say something, it was mainly my son who was saying this, say something that involves the stories that you know that illustrate the various phases of this history. And so it's, in that respect, the book has a lot of my own personal and family history in it, because what I tried to do was to make the pretty stark realities that I was talking about approachable and understandable through people's lives, whether it was my grandmother's life or the life of one of my uncles or stuff that my father told me, or the things in the last few chapters where I come closer to the present that I actually personally experienced. And so every chapter of the book is keyed to, as I've said, either family or personal experiences, or things that I came to know intimately. And that's why I hope it's readable. That's why it seems to sell better than anything I've ever written. Obviously showing that my son was right. I'll say a little bit about the book. I don't want to bore you. I'll just say a little bit about the book. I honestly think that the title and the subtitle encompass all of the main themes of the book. The title of the book is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. And if you want to understand how to answer every lying trope that's out there, every falsehood peddled by the corporate mainstream media, every lie that drips from the mouths of the spokespersons for the Biden administration and every other administration, every word that you see in the public space. The very title of this book, I think, helps you to understand why these things are false. This is not a conflict in Palestine. This is a war on the Palestinian people. When I started writing it, it had been going on, in my estimation, for 100 years. It's been going on for much longer. I wrote this book, I started writing it in 2017. Actually, a little earlier. It came out in 2020. It's now been 100 and whatever it is years. The point is, it is not a war between two peoples in Palestine. That's only a very small part of it. It is a war on Palestine. And it's not just a war between Israelis and Palestinians. There is a huge, fat thumb on the scale of this war, and that is an American thumb. The United States has been a direct participant in every episode of this war since the 1940s. In fact, it is a direct, even more direct participant today. The United States is actually participating with Israel in targeting people in Palestine. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said that the other day. And that's in addition, of course, to the boatloads of money and the boatloads of weapons and the air shipments of other equipment and weaponry that are being used to slaughter Palestinians. The United States is a direct participant in this war. Without the shield of the Security Council, without the lies told by Admiral Kirby from the podium of the National Security Council, without the wall-to-wall support of the American government, this war could not continue for 1 minute. And so, seeing it as a war on Palestine rather than a war in Palestine, or just a war between these two national groups, is, I think, absolutely essential to dealing with the torrent of lies with which we've all been, inundated since I have been since I was a kid. I was born in New York City. I've been listening to this stuff since I was sentient. And some of you are old enough to remember the kind of tripe that was out there in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, and it hasn't changed very much. The second part of the book, the subtitle, A History of Settler Colonialism. People will tell you, well, Zionism is a national movement. People will tell you, but Zionism is a refuge for people who are persecuted. People will tell you, well, there's a biblical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, or the Holy Land, or Palestine. And in fact, those are not falsehoods. Zionism is a national movement. There is a historical connection between Judaism and Palestine. And in fact, Zionism was conceived as a refuge for persecuted Jews after millennia of European Christian anti-Semitism. It was envisioned by people from Europe who were the descendants of people who had been persecuted for millennia, generations. It was always, and it envisaged itself as and was a national movement. And there's a biblical connection. Nobody can dispute those things. But it is also a settler colonial movement, a settler colonial project self-defined by its founders. Text after text, institution after institution they called themselves colonists. They said, we're buying land through the Jewish Colonization Agency. That's not some anti-Semitic slur made up by some 21st century historian. That's what they called it themselves. It was still in existence until the 1950s. So, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can be a national movement, which in fact Zionism started as, and you can be a settler colonial project. There's absolutely no contradiction between those two things. In fact, many settler colonial projects turn into national projects. We are living in a settler colonial project, which has become a national project. The settler colonial project in what was then called Northern Rhodesia declared independence. It's now Zimbabwe. That project was defeated. So this is not unusual. Zionism is unusual in many respects, but it's not actually unique in that respect and in some others. So that's why the second term, A History of Settler Colonialism, is so important. If you don't understand that, you don't understand the nature of what's going on. This is not just two people fighting for the same land. This is one people systematically and intentionally usurping and dispossessing another people. That's always been the objective. This was a country that had an overwhelming Arab majority, right up to 1948. Over 2/3 of the population was Arab in 1948. The objective was to turn it into a Jewish state. How do you do that without removing the Arab population? Physically impossible. It had to be, necessarily, in order to create its objective, which was a Jewish state. It had to be a project to dispossess the native population. It couldn't have been otherwise. There was no project to live in peace with an Arab majority. That wasn't the idea. The idea came out of the view that you couldn't live in peace with Gentiles as a result of experiences in Eastern Europe, which proved to be correct. Most of the people came who wrote the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel came from within 100 miles of what is today Kiev, and what is today Ukraine, from areas that are now in Belarus and in Russia. They were people who would have been obliterated by the Nazis had they not left. Without exception, they would have been victims of the Nazi genocide of the Holocaust. So this is a project which did not envisage coming to live together with Arabs. It envisaged coming and creating a Jewish space, an exclusively Jewish space, in an entirely Arab space. And that necessitated ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and what we see today in different forms in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. The last part of the title, resistance, is absolutely essential. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You oppress and dispossess and discriminate against and kill a population, an indigenous population, and they will resist. Nothing could possibly be simpler. And to describe the violence of Native Americans or South Africans or Algerians as the terrorist action of murderous fanatics, which is how each of those peoples were described in our colonial history, in Algerian, in French versions of Algerian history, in settler white South African history, is an utter falsehood. This is a response to settler colonial violence. It cannot be any other way. It has never been otherwise in human history. And to see it otherwise, to take this out of context, which our mass media invariably does, which our laws actually do, is to do violence to reality, to do violence to history. So, that's in summary what the book tries to do. It tries to explain that. I do it through 6 chapters, each of which is described as a declaration of war on the Palestinians. And the key thing here is that these are not declarations of war, in most cases, by the Zionist movement or Israel. These are declarations of war by the government of the United Kingdom and Great Britain, or by the United Nations at the behest of the United States and the Soviet Union in 1947, or by the Johnson administration in 1967, or by the Reagan administration in 1982. The declaration of war and the key participant in these wars against the Palestinians to dispossess them and replace them are made by the great imperial powers of the age. This is not a war between Palestinians and Israelis. This is a war in which great powers have decided that they will back this project, that they will do what is necessary to make it successful, and they are the ones who decide in the Balfour Declaration, in the Partition Resolution of 1947, in the UN Security Council Resolution of 1967, in the American green light for the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. They decide. And whether it's them or in the case of the mandate period, the British Army, which carries out the war, which actually wages the war in which Palestinians are killed, is secondary. Today, it's Israeli soldiers doing the killing, Israeli pilots doing the killing. But the people who have decided that this can go ahead, the people without whose money and diplomacy and so forth, this could not have happened, are in Washington and in other European white capitals. So I'm not going to go through chapters of the book. I'll stop here, I think. I've said, I think, enough for you to get an idea of what the book is about. I hope you can read it as an ebook, as a physical book, as an audio book, as a whatever book you choose to read. And thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you want us to go up there?
Can we just put essentially?
Oh, okay, we'll pass it back and forth. Okay, so I should turn this thing on. You got it. Let's go.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your opening comments. So could you describe what this thing is called the Palestine question?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is this question?
What is the Palestine question? The Palestine question is the way in which Palestinians, at least, have chosen to frame what's going on, rather than saying this is an Arab-Israeli conflict, or rather than saying this is a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Palestine question is the issue that was raised by the events that I've just talked about. It's the issue of what is being done to Palestine. It's the issue of what the great powers have decided to do in and about Palestine. It's also the way in which the question is framed before the United Nations. When it comes up before the UN General Assembly, it's under the rubric of the Palestine question. And the word Palestine, and the idea of Palestine, and the very physical reality of Palestine, is something that the Zionist project and later the State of Israel have worked night and day to eliminate. They don't want this to be seen as being about Palestine or the Palestinians. They don't want this to be seen as something that has to do with what is being done to Palestine. They don't want it to be seen, in other words, in the way in which I just described it, as a war on Palestine and the Palestinians. They'd much prefer to frame it in terms of Jewish self-determination, in terms of the miraculous creation of Israel in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of some of the things I've talked about, which happen, some of them to be true, but which are intended, when you replace Palestine with these things, to obliterate Palestine from the map. And that is something that many Israeli leaders thought that they had done in the 50s. It's done, we've gotten rid of them. Ben-Gurion is reported to have said, the old will die, the young will forget. Well, the old do die, but the young have clearly not forgotten. And the world has forgotten, or did for a very long time. And all kinds of actions were necessary to force the world to, were necessary, thank you, were necessary to force the world to pay attention again. So the question of Palestine is a way of framing this in terms of Palestine, which I think is what it's really about.
Thank you. So what would you say that most people commonly get wrong about Palestinian history, and how does that affect their political understanding?
Carrington, where do I start?
We have a lot of questions.
No, what people get wrong, I mean, all of the things that I've just been talking about that my book is about are attempts to respond to some of the main ways in which people get things wrong. And that's really what I was trying to do with this book. I wasn't trying to answer an academic question, or a question about Palestinian identity, or a question about Palestinian statehood, which are the titles and subtitles of earlier books. I was trying to answer the incredible number of lies that are out there and that people believe about Palestine. I mentioned some of them. This is not just a struggle between Palestinians and Israelis. This is a struggle between great powers and the Palestinians, and great powers together with Israel and the Palestinians. This is not a situation in which the driving motivation of the Palestinians is anti-Semitism. This is a situation in which the driving motivation of Palestinians is the usurpation of their country, the theft of their land, and their physical dispossession. 750,000 people in 1948, 300 or 350,000 in 1967, and more and more and more as time goes on. That's what it's about. And to divert it into quote-unquote terrorism or anti-Semitism is to bury those realities. There are many, many others. I would say those are probably two of the most important. I mean, you just need to read need to, if you really have a strong constitution, read the New York Times any morning and you will see a dozen of these lies. And so, obviously, my book is not. I would have to write an Encyclopedia Britannica to answer all the lies in the New York Times, but it's an attempt to answer some of them.
Thank you. Okay, so as mentioned, we are activists, and we want to know, especially since so much of the horror comes from our country, you know, what can we do as Americans to, you know, just do our part to help. And as you know, political educators, we like to take lessons from history. So that's what this question is. Your takeaway on, you describe like from 1918 to 1933, you describe these 15 years where like the noble class, I think you call them, the notable, excuse me, that's my typo. So the Palestinian notable class tries for 15 years to persuade the British in particular to see the Palestinian side of things. In the meantime, the Palestinian general population, you know, was asking at times for a full boycott of the British authorities and a tax strike. Do you think things could have been done differently at that early stage to achieve a better result for Palestinians? And you know, are there lessons? Sorry. Are there lessons here that could be applied to today's efforts toward justice for Palestine? And my question is sort of about light diplomacy versus making more forceful demands. If you have theories of change.
I mean, you asked two completely different questions. The first is what we can do. And the second is a really important question about what the Palestinians didn't do and what they did wrong and what they could do. And let me leave the first one and answer the second one, because that's mainly what I think you're asking about. And I lay out in this book and in an earlier book many of what I think were the mistakes made by Palestinian leaders. You actually touched on some of them. The fact that the masses, public opinion, the people, understood that a much more militant approach was necessary to deal with the British and the Zionist project that they were nurturing. And the notable leadership thought that they could talk to the British and that would somehow convince them, and were unwilling or unable to put on the British, the kind of pressure that would have been necessary to change things. Now, I don't know, I don't have a counterfactual about what they could and should have done at point A or point B or point C. It's perfectly clear that what they did was insufficient. It's perfectly clear that what was coming up from below, from public opinion, Palestinian public opinion, was probably more correct than what the leadership was trying to do or willing to do. It's perfectly clear, I mean, I'm a Middle East historian, I'm not just a historian of Palestine. It's perfectly clear that those peoples who rose up in the immediate aftermath of World War I against colonial oppression were much more likely to have been successful than were peoples who tried to negotiate with their colonial oppressors. So whether it was in India or whether it was in Egypt or whether it was in Iraq or whether it was in other places, or most importantly, Ireland, where there actually was an armed uprising or mass uprising against colonial power, they were much more successful in the interwar period than were the Palestinians, who didn't really rise up in a major way until 1936. Ireland is the only colonized country to achieve independence before World War II. And it did so because of the Irish War of Independence in 1918, 19, 20, 21. If it hadn't been for that, Ireland would have still been under the crown for much longer than it was. And other countries that rose up didn't necessarily achieve independence, but they pushed themselves much closer to it. And the Palestinians, for various reasons, didn't do that until much too late. So I'm not saying armed struggle is the only way. One of the things that the successful movements that ultimately achieved independence did was to use a mix of methods: boycotts, strikes, armed struggle, diplomacy, public propaganda directed at the colonial power. The Irish won because they were directing what they said and did to American and British publics at the same time as they were ambushing British soldiers in Donegal or Cork or whatever it may have been. And the same is true of other revolutionary movements that have succeeded. The same thing is true of the Algerians. They spent a lot of time, fighting the French army and doing other things that were horrific in some cases. But at the same time, they were directing a message to the French public, which ultimately succeeded. Public opinion forced the French to leave Algeria. The Vietnamese did the same thing. They were fighting in Vietnam, and they were talking to American elites and American publics. And it took a long time for that to succeed. I think you have to do both things. And you have to do many other things. I mean, in every one of the cases that I've mentioned, India, Ireland, South Africa, boycott was a crucial element. And that people will say, oh, you have to do only armed struggle, or you have to only do diplomacy. No, you have to do a number of things. And each of those examples, I think, shows what a possible avenue, successful avenue could be. Obviously, each situation is different. And the situation of the Palestinians in 2024 is different to what it was in 1924 or 1934.
Thank you, and I want to come back to public opinion, but first, you cite external international support as a major contributing factor toward achieving Zionist goals in the dispossession of Palestine. Britain, the League of Nations, the UN, from the Balfour Declaration to resolutions 181 and 242 and beyond, cleared the way for a Jewish state, legitimating it despite the violence, ethnic cleansing, and other crimes against humanity and violations of international law. Today we see international institutional outrage at Israel's brutal siege of Gaza and genocide of Palestinians. Institutions such as the ICC has warrants out for the arrest of Netanyahu and others. The ICJ has ruled Israel must halt military offensives. And I guess just this Wednesday, the UN General Assembly made demands that Israel end its unlawful presence in occupied Palestinian territory within a year. Okay, what role do you think international institutions can play today? I know it's 100 years later, or it's however many years later. Do you think it's possible that the entities that helped both establish Israel and protect it from prosecution for war crimes could now meaningfully help hold it to account?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Carrington. I think we have to look at how these international institutions, to which we give perhaps exaggerated respect, were constructed and who put them together. It wasn't, the entire world in 1918 and 1919 that put together the League of Nations. It was the great powers that won World War I. They created it, they dominated it, they manipulated it, and the League of Nations was not a league of nations. First of all, most nations in that period were under colonial rule. They weren't represented in the League of Nations, and they were not allowed to even approach the League of Nations. They weren't even allowed to petition the League of Nations. The British made sure that neither Indians nor Palestinians nor Egyptians ever came near Geneva to speak to the Council of the League or any other body of the League of Nations. And that's true of the United Nations. It was a creation of the victors of World War II. And they gave themselves veto power in the Security Council. Nothing has changed. So while the United Nations has become much more representative than it was in 1945 when it was founded, and while the General Assembly represents the opinion of the world, and so the resolution you're talking about very clearly represents how most people in the world feel. The big countries, India, China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so on, the countries that have the largest population, Nigeria, Brazil, they all voted for this resolution. Billions of people, or their governments, have voted for that resolution. But the tiny number of countries that have vetoes on the Security Council still control the United Nations. So, I don't think that means we should ignore the United Nations, the fact that it is still dominated by these original victors of World War II. But it means we should have limited expectations for what it can do. What it means is that we have to work on those countries which have those vetoes. We have to work inside the French, with the French public. We're not in France. Or if we're Britain, the British public. And we have to work in this country. Those are the three obstacles at the United Nations to any progress. I noticed, by the way, that the French voted for that resolution. The British abstained. The United States and a few of the islands that it still maintains as semi-colonial dependencies, and a couple of other countries Hungary and Israel and a couple of others voted against. And that's an indication of the way in which global public opinion is moving. Even in a country like France, which has a very hostile position towards the Palestinians, the government apparently felt it was wiser to vote for that resolution. And that's an indication of the fact that public opinion in France, in spite of the hostility of the French media, in spite of the hostility of the entire French elite, has shifted things in France. And I think that can be done. It'll be harder here, but that can be done here too.
Great. So that brings us to our next question, where in your book you cite Zionist public relations and resulting public support as a major contributing factor toward the establishment and legitimization of the Jewish state and the erasure of Palestinians and Palestine. In public perception, is public perception of Israel shifting? And do you see an opening here for activists that has not historically been available? Relatedly, do you have thoughts on the protests and their potential impact and the various forms the protests take? And then finally, do you think Israel is losing control of the narrative? Yeah. That's a few questions at once.
Those are great questions. I think Israel is losing control of the narrative. I think the protests had an enormous effect globally and nationally. And I think public opinion is shifting faster than I ever would have believed possible. I honestly never believed that the entire base of the Democratic Party would have moved as far as it has. The leadership of that party is a cork in the bottle, preventing any change. The gerontocracy that controls the party, the money that flows into the party, the people who are dyed-in-the-wool Zionists are in control of the Democratic Party. There hasn't been an inch of movement as far as the party at the top is concerned, and the base has moved enormously in the past several years. I've been astonished, as has public opinion generally. Even Republicans, and certainly also independents using those measures of polling, have moved enormously in the past couple of years. A majority of Americans are against the war in Gaza. A majority of Americans are against sending arms to Israel. A majority of Americans oppose the Biden administration's policies. That could not have happened in an earlier era. So yes, public opinion is changing. And I'll go back to your question about the narrative. It's partly changing because the narrative simply cannot sustain itself. This is not David and Goliath. This is not a tiny little Israel surrounded and beleaguered and the victim of mindless aggression. This is clearly an enormously powerful regional superpower backed by the greatest power on earth, pounding a relatively defensive Palestinian population. Everybody sees that. Now, some people justify it, but the number of people who justify it and think it's legitimate and should be supported has actually shrunk remarkably on all sides, especially among progressives, but to a very great extent among everybody else. Now, what does that mean? I think it means a lot of thinking about how to bring more people over to where most progressives are. And that means a variety of tactics, it means a variety of approaches, it means maybe sometimes talking to people you don't fully agree with. And there are some people who don't believe in that. They only want to talk to people who agree with them 100%. You know, you have to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 19, 28, 37 on my list, or I don't agree with you and I can't agree to be in a coalition with you. Okay, you're not necessarily in the same party or the same movement or the same activist group, but if you don't win over people, sooner or later, you're not going to be able to change things. Now, we all know how hard it is to change any major policy of this country. Look at how long it took to end the Vietnam War. Public opinion shifted against the Vietnam War years before it ended, and they kept waging war in Vietnam. When I was a student, I think public opinion had shifted by 1970. The war didn't end until 1975. Same thing is true with the Iraq War. And those are wars in which American soldiers were actually being killed. This is a war that the United States pretends that's not its war. It is its war. But the administration and the media pretend it's over there and we have nothing to do with it and so forth. So it'll even be harder. But I think that the shift that has taken place in public opinion so far and the disintegration of the Zionist narrative should encourage us. I really think that change is possible on this front. It won't be quick. This is going to be a long-term war. It will take a while. There'll be a lot of people slaughtered, unfortunately, before it's over. But mainly Palestinians, obviously, and heaven forbid, maybe also Lebanese and other people, as well as obviously Israelis. But change is happening, and I think that a lot can be done to facilitate that.
Thank you so much. So how are we for time? We're good. All right. So you mentioned in one of your criticisms of Palestinian political leadership that it, quote, does not have any idea of how to engage with American public opinion and has made no serious attempt to do so. The ignorance of the complex nature of the US political system has prevented the fashioning of a sustained program to reach potentially sympathetic elements of civil society. You compare this unfavorably in terms of effectiveness with Zionist groups. And I guess that's kind of what we're talking about already. Can you expand on this aspect of American public opinion more? What kind of potentials, in your view, are not being tapped? What kind of messages could resonate more? And I guess something we didn't touch on was, you do speak about that with Arafat a lot, that he misses out on a lot of messaging opportunities. We don't want to be like that.
Well, you know, this is again, another vast topic, but it's a really good question. And this has to do with things that we don't have a lot of influence over, whether as Americans or in my case as a Palestinian American or Palestinian. I mean, the Palestinians are suffering from a deeply divided national movement. They have almost a vacuum as far as leadership is concerned. On the one side, there's a gerontocracy that is operating as almost agents of the occupation in Ramallah. And on the other side, you have a leadership in Gaza, which, again, doesn't have democratic credentials. It doesn't have the kind of legitimacy that can only come from a kind of popular support that's not just a result of you fight the oppressor and then people are going to support you. And the divisions are debilitating for the Palestinians. And the key element is a lack of a clear, unified consensus on strategy. And you can't have a message, you mentioned messaging. You can't address yourself to the outside world unless you have a clear strategy. And there is not a single clear strategy. I could go into more detail on this, but this is a Palestinian issue. If you want, during questions, I can speak more to this. However, one of the encouraging things that has happened in the past decade or more, during which this situation of division has characterized Palestinian politics, is that Palestinian civil society has to some extent stepped into the gap and provided, through things like boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, through things like encouragement to the student movement here in this country, through efforts to encourage people to come to Palestine, visit Palestine, see the reality in Palestine, through a variety of efforts by Palestinian civil society. They have, to some extent, taken the place of what is absent, which is a unified leadership with a clear strategic aim. And until the Palestinians are able to resolve that problem, we're just not going to have that. And you can't have where does this people want to go? And that's not clear. That's not clear to anybody, including the best analysts of Palestinian society and politics. And that's, to my way of thinking, that's a problem in terms of how you address the outside world. You can talk about injustice, you can talk about tactics like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and that's effective. You can try and change the narrative. That's extremely effective. And I think that Palestinian civil society has done that. There is no such thing as Palestinian diplomacy, almost. Besides efforts at the United Nations and in a few places where there are effective Palestinian diplomats, there's no Palestinian diplomatic strategy. There's no Palestinian public diplomacy as far as the official level is concerned. And yet the narrative has changed, and I think that in large measure, not mainly or only, but in large measure, that's thanks to efforts by Palestinian civil society.
Thank you. So you described the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, where 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes, losing everything, their land, their livelihood, even their lives. and became refugees. You describe this as ongoing to this day. Do you see Israel's ambitions for a greater Israel as part of the continuation of the Nakba? Again, are there lessons from history that can be applied here toward justice for Palestine and I guess those that Israel would have be greater Israel?
The objective was always much greater Israel than what the United Nations partition plan would have given to a Jewish state. The partition plan would have given that Jewish state 55% of a country in which Jews were a 33% minority. As a result of expansion of that state during the war of 1948, Israel ended up controlling 78%. They were only stopped by outside forces from taking the whole of it. They were on the way to taking much more, and they would have if they could have. Ben-Gurion was very dissatisfied that he couldn't take the whole of it. And that was always the objective. When the Biltmore Conference took place in this city in 1942, the stated aim of the Zionist movement at this conference that was held with Chaim Weizmann here and Ben-Gurion here and so on was the transformation of Palestine, all of it, into a Jewish commonwealth, by which they meant a Jewish state. The objective was always to turn all of Palestine. The only quibble within the Zionist movement was, would you also take the East Bank of the Jordan, which the revisionist wing of the Zionist movement wanted to do. There was no quibble over taking all of it. They just couldn't do it in 48. And then they did it in 67. So that has always been the objective. And everything that Israel has done since 1967 to incorporate, annex, colonize, steal, and settle 700,000 of its citizens in the West Bank shows that that's what the state has always intended to do. So whether the greater land of Israel extends as far as some of the more messianic elements to, from the Nile to the Euphrates, there are people in the Israeli far right who talk about that. Or whether we're just talking about between the river and the sea, which is the Likud platform, by the way, of 1977, from the river to the sea, which is the stated program of the current Israeli government, from the river to the sea. This is not some genocidal Palestinian slogan. This is a core statement of the party that has ruled Israel for most of the period since 1977. That was their platform when they ran for the elections of 1977. That is the platform of the government that rules Israel today. And that has been, I would argue, their objective since the beginning. We're not seeing something that is developing newly because of a very bad man called Benjamin Netanyahu, or because of a couple of evil counselors called Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. This goes back to Biltmore in 1942. This goes back to what Chaim Weizmann said to Balfour and Lloyd George and Churchill at a dinner in London in 1924. They said to him, we intended by the Balfour Declaration for you to have a Jewish state in all of Palestine. And he said, yes, that's what we want. This is not something new.
This is related. In your book, you cite Kissinger stating that if there were another Middle East crisis, quote, the end result would be what we have worked all these years to avoid. It would create Arab unity.
Read that again. That's a great quote.
Okay, this is Kissinger. Quote, the end result would be what we have worked all these years to avoid. It would create Arab unity. In your book, you describe the goal of early resistance groups, and that part of that goal is Arab unity. Do you think the escalation toward regional war could create or is creating anything like it? And could you share, or any other thoughts you might have on the theme?
Another good question. Thank you. Couple of thoughts here. The first is that there actually is Arab unity when you talk about the Arab peoples. The Arab Center in Qatar has been doing annual opinion polling in 12 to 14 Arab countries over many years. And they show overwhelming support in every single country, in the 80s and 90s for the Palestinians. They show overwhelming resistance to the idea of normalization with Israel until Israel recognizes Palestinian rights. And they show that Arab public opinion, that on the level of public opinion, there is Arab unity. So what's the problem? The problem is not the Arab peoples, the problem is the Arab governments. The Arab world is a black hole of authoritarianism in the entire world. From a period in the 70s and 80s and 90s where more democratic regimes began to appear in different parts of the world, South Korea, South Asia, Latin America, East Europe, and so on and so forth, the Middle East in general, but especially the Arab countries, were completely resistant to those shifts towards more democratic governance. And from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf, you have an unparalleled collection of jackboot dictatorships, of the most absolute monarchies since Louis XIV, of kleptocracies which rob their peoples of their wealth in order to build monuments and palaces for themselves and buy property in New York and London and Paris. So the Arab peoples have the misfortune to be governed, for the most part, by a collection of awful regimes, awful undemocratic regimes, which ignore public opinion where Palestine is concerned, and which are beholden, because of their lack of legitimacy. They don't have democratic legitimacy. How can you have democratic legitimacy if you refuse to have elections? Or if you have elections like as took place recently in Algeria, which gave 99% to or 98% to the president? You have no legitimacy in that case. You need external support. And the United States is happy to provide that external support. And when Arab people rose up against a number of their governments, starting in 2011, guess who was in the breach to make sure that the dictators and the kings stayed in power? The most important American clients in the region, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, bankrolled the reaction against these democratic upheavals. So there is a problem of Arab unity, and the problem is not the Arabs, the problem is their governments. And that is an Arab problem which is quite serious. This is a region that is deeply penetrated by outside forces. Many, many regions are, but this is a strategically important region and has always been since the dawn of history. And it has, since the dawn of the 20th century, been a region where we now know the vast proportion of the world's oil and gas reserves are located. And so it has been put upon by outside powers for a very, very long time, and in the modern era, particularly by Britain and the United States. And that has distorted the politics of these countries in a way that they distort the politics of other countries, the way they distort the politics of Haiti, or the way they distort the politics of many other places in the world. But the Middle East has been subject to a very high level of this for a very long time, and the result is this clutch of tin pot dictators and absolute monarchs who are a blight on the face of the earth.
Thank you. So you point to the First Intifada in the early 90s as one of the Palestinian national movement's greatest successes to date. What made this Intifada such a success, and why hasn't the movement been able to recreate these successes either in the second Intifada in the early aughts or subsequently?
Yeah, the First Intifada was one of the very few great successes of the Palestinian national movement, in my opinion. I think those successes were squandered in the negotiations I participated in, and even more so in the later Oslo and subsequent negotiations. But looked at in terms of their impact on Israel, looked at in terms of their impact on American public opinion and world public opinion, what people did in that Intifada from 1987 to the early 90s was enormously successful. It forced Israel to rethink how it was going to try and maintain its occupation. It forced the Israelis to deal with the Palestinians in ways they had never, ever been willing to do since 1948. And it forced the United States to change. It forced Secretary of State Baker to bring the Palestinians into a negotiation, which they had been excluded from systematically since well before 1948. The Palestinians were never allowed to even come to the table. These are results of the First Intifada. Now, I repeat, they were squandered, in my view, for a variety of reasons. Israel, unfortunately, took some of the wrong lessons from the First Intifada. Instead of saying we really have to give the Palestinians self-determination, they tried to figure out a way to maintain their colonization, maintain their control, and make concessions that would not jeopardize colonization and control. Rabin was the first Israeli prime minister to agree to talk to the PLO, but under Rabin, settlements continued to increase. Rabin never accepted the idea of a fully independent Palestinian state. His last speech before the Knesset, just before he was murdered for making the concessions that he did make, said, "We are willing to give the Palestinians less than a state, and we will maintain security control over the Jordan River Valley." That means Israel maintains the occupation. That means you're not talking about independence or sovereignty or self-determination. That means, as he said, honestly, to his credit, less than a state. It's not a state. In other words, some kind of glorified Bantustan. And the lesson that they learned was the kind of largely nonviolent protest that characterized the First Intifada must not be allowed to continue. So when people launched a similar, mainly mass, mainly popular uprising in 2000, the Israeli army responded with 1 million bullets. And the eventual response from the Palestinian side was bullets and later on suicide bombing. So the Israelis learned the wrong lesson, unfortunately. And the Palestinians fell into what I would argue in the Second Intifada was a trap. And we've been in that logic ever since. When people in the Gaza Strip launched what they called the Great March of Return a few years ago, and unarmed people, walked to the border fence, they were met with 200 people killed by snipers and well over 1,000 people maimed by having their knees shot out, by snipers sitting hundreds of meters away, completely safe, never endangered, no Israeli casualties throughout the entirety of this many-month-long thing. And people were being shot down like animals. The objective was to show that nonviolence doesn't work. And that has been the lesson that Israeli repression has been trying to teach the Palestinians. Nothing you do nonviolently will work. And they also say, obviously, they're trying to push people to violence, which in the Israeli lexicon is easier to deal with.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I've heard it described as a peace offensive when they are peaceful. It's still taken as an offensive. So we want to go to Q&A, but just a couple questions. First, we want to ask about Oslo and also your conclusion, where you sort of take a overall big picture analysis of the situation and sort of where it's headed. And that was a couple of years ago, and a lot has happened in the past couple of years. So if I could just first ask about Oslo, and then we'll get to that, and then we'll get to Q&A, if that's cool. All right, so you are I think I'm going to combine these two questions. You are highly critical of the Oslo Accords, which in your opinion did little to alter Israeli colonial domination of Palestine and empowered hardliners on both sides through their failure. Can you elaborate further on the flaws with these accords and how they created the conditions for the present crisis? And then here's the second one. This book has a moving Oh, we cut it. Hold on, sorry. Sumaya Awad was supposed to be here today, and like at 2 o'clock, we found out her daughter had a terrible fever, and so I'm here last minute. You were supposed to have Sumaya, but you got me, so forgive any shortcomings. Okay, here.
You get yourself ready. I don't want to go in detail into the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were, in my view, what Edward Said called a Palestinian Versailles. They were a capitulation by the PLO, acting without the advice of a lot of people who would have argued for a very different approach. And the end result of the Oslo Accords was a massive expansion of settlement, colonization, a imprisonment of the Palestinians within walls and checkpoints that did not exist before the Oslo Accords. I was living in Jerusalem for a large part of the 3 years before the Oslo Accords, and you could drive anywhere in Israel, in the occupied territories, from the Golan Heights to to Gaza, almost without hindrance. There were no obstacles. You could do that in a West plate, in a car with West Bank license plates. Palestinians moved freely. Palestinians worked within Israel. The separation, the imprisonment, the immiseration of Palestinians that followed the Oslo Accords reduced Palestinian GDP per capita between the Oslo Accords and 2000 significantly. It restricted Palestinian freedom of movement to the point that Palestinians became prisoners sometimes within their own towns. You had to go through a checkpoint to go to a neighboring town. None of that existed before the Oslo Accords. So the Oslo Accords actually, I could go into the details, but the Oslo Accords actually made the Palestinians infinitely worse off in terms of personal welfare, freedom of movement, and in terms of a horizon, because the Oslo Accords never provided for statehood or self-determination. People who say these were peace accords are lying through their teeth. What Hillary Clinton said the other day when she said that the students don't know history. If the Palestinians had accepted what my husband offered, they would have a state today. No, they would not have had a state today. The Oslo Accords were designed to prevent Palestinian statehood by Israel and the United States. And what Clinton offered at Camp David in 2000 was a reheated version of what Rabin said in his last speech before he was assassinated. Less than a state, Israeli control over the Jordan River Valley, which means Israeli control over entry and exit, the population registry, the airspace, everything else. It doesn't mean independence, it doesn't mean statehood. Hillary Clinton doesn't know history. And she accuses the students of not knowing history. I could say more about the Oslo Accords, but I think that's enough.
Okay, so our last questions here are, the book has a moving personal element with your family's history intertwined in it. You also point out that that's complicated because of your family's class character. I wonder if you could tease out a bit more how social class has shaped the development of Palestinian politics. Seems like it is not discussed enough, and it is right up socialist alley.
I go in some detail in the book and in an earlier book into the failures of the Palestinian leadership up to 1948. Largely, not entirely, but largely because of its class nature. It was an elite, upper class, largely urban, entirely male dominated elite leadership, which was very much out of touch with public opinion, which was very much out of touch with other classes in society, which was very undemocratic in its approach. And that was among many, many reasons for the failures of the period up to 1948. And my family was part of that. And my uncle was part of that leadership. My uncle was the last elected Arab mayor of Jerusalem, elected in 1935, deposed by the British and exiled in 1937. Some of them were great patriots, but they all were deeply, deeply limited by their class origins. Now, something quite drastic happened to Palestinian society after 1948. The material basis of the prosperity, the wealth, and the prestige of that class was entirely demolished by the Nakba. They lost their property. They became people who had maybe human capital, education, connections, but they lost their money or their land or their businesses. And so Palestinian society underwent a kind of revolutionary change that happened in many other Arab societies as a result of revolution. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952 deposed a similar class. The Syrian revolutions of the 50s deposed a similar class. The Iraqi Revolution of 1958 deposed a similar class, and so on. And the leadership that emerged in the 1950s and 60s had an entirely different class base. It was educated, middle-class people who were entirely different. Almost nobody from those old families made it into the Palestinian leadership of the past 50 or 60 years. Almost nobody. There's actually one person that I can think of, one exception. There were a few upper middle class individuals. Otherwise, people came from mainly the lower middle class, people whose families had maybe not had education, people who achieved education, and who became the leaders of the various movements of the PLO and of the current political formations. So that was a revolutionary change that was a result not of revolution as in Egypt and elsewhere, but of the Nakba. So I think that the Palestinians have many other problems. There are problems of age. I mean, one of the problems that we have in many societies is the control by gerontocracies over our politics. The Palestinians suffer from that to some extent. One of the problems is the patriarchy. Palestinians, we know about that in this country. Palestinians suffer from that as well. I mean, look at the leadership of several of these movements. There are almost no women. There are very few younger people. Now, that can change, and that hopefully will change, and it is changing to some extent. You had women active for a long, long time. Students have always been important in Palestinian politics, and they're going to be more important as time goes on. And I hope in both cases, this issue of patriarchy and this issue of the gerontocracy will be shattered. But it is a problem that the Palestinians labor with and struggle with.
Okay, and then for our final question, in the conclusion to 100 years, the 100 Years' War on Palestine, you give an analysis of where things stand and where you see them going. Can you say a little about how your analysis has shifted, or just maybe how the past year has had to modify that analysis, or maybe not? Maybe it confirmed your analysis.
You really want me to say a little about the last year?
You can hit it in the Q&A too.
I mean, it's really hard to say anything quickly about the extraordinary events of the past year. I mean, anybody who looked at the world on the 5th or 6th of October was looking at a different world than we face today in the Middle East. The possibility of Israel completely ignoring the Palestinians and achieving a settlement with the most reprehensible regimes on earth, which it had already began to do with the Bahraini government, with the Sudanese military, with the Emirati government, with the Moroccan monarchy. That looked like a likelihood, not a possibility. The continuation of everything that Israel was doing against the Palestinians with no response looked very possible on the 6th of October. And so much has changed. I wouldn't even begin to try to summarize everything that has happened or what I think that means. It's early days. Part of the problem is we're in the middle of a war. This is a new phase of 100 Years' War, but it is a specific phase. And it's like trying to say in 1941, well, how do you think World War II is going to go? Well, I don't know how World War II is going to go in 1941. Nobody did. Or 1942. And we may be even earlier than that in this war. I see no likelihood of it ending anytime soon, the way things seem to be going. And I may be proven wrong tomorrow, because it's impossible to say. But a lot will depend on the outcome of this struggle. And that means the outcome of this struggle in this country, because we are the prime driver of this war. Without this country, this war could not be going on. And a lot will depend on how Americans react to the complicity of their country in war crimes and genocide and ethnic cleansing. One of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of the United States was the first couple of weeks of the war, when the Secretary of State of the United States trotted around the Middle East as an errand boy for Israel, begging Arab governments to take the ethnically cleansed population of Gaza. He went to Cairo, he went to Amman, and he went to Riyadh. And he had the door slammed in his face by Arab rulers, none of whom is a Democrat, and none of whom is really responsive to their peoples in many ways, but who under no circumstances were going to allow the United States to strong-arm them into letting Israel drive the population of Gaza out. That is one of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of the United States. In 1948, Israel carried out ethnic cleansing. The United States didn't stop it, but the United States didn't facilitate it. The United States didn't try to help it happen. The United States tried feebly in the aftermath of 1948 to force Israel to allow the refugees to return. Secretary of State Blinken was an errand boy for ethnic cleansing, and the United States has served as the essential prop of this war. Every single warplane used to bomb Gaza is American. Every artillery piece, every helicopter is American. Most of the shells and bombs are American. We pay for them. We pay for them. They're free to user because of our tax dollars. If we do something about that, then the course of the war changes, and then what I would say about the impact of the war would have to change. So unfortunately, it's not early days. It's in a week or two, it's in a week and 10 days, whatever, it's going to be 2 weeks. It's going to be one full year of this genocide. And we may be on the brink of an entirely new chapter of this war with Lebanon, being the theater, and possibly even a broader theater in the Middle East. So I'm not going to say very much more than that. It's impossible to say.
Could I just say, is there something you could see, like DSA in particular, or activists in particular, like when you see the protests, are you thinking, why aren't they doing this, or they should just do this, or it would be such a great idea if they did this, or do you have any advice for us like that? And then I'm going to go to the Q&A. And if it comes to you later, that's fine too.
I hate to tell people what to do. I never tell my students what to do. I've mentored maybe 60 PhD students. I never told them what to do. And they all did whatever they wanted. And most of the time they were right. And when they weren't, it's none of my business. And I don't presume to tell DSA or anybody who's protesting what to do. All I would say are two things. The first is it's absolutely essential to spread more information about the realities out there. And that means just getting out basic stuff. I always argued that one of the great things about a divestment movement on campus is not that we're going to get the boards of trustees, the billionaires who own and run these universities, private universities, or the characters in state legislatures who run state universities to divest. They won't do it. It's that we will educate students, or the students will educate students, about what Israeli apartheid is like, about what ethnic cleansing has been like, about what is actually going on in Palestine, and that in turn will change realities. I mean, if we can get divestment, all the better. So the first thing is, what we should be doing is to change people's understanding of these things. And the broader swath of people we reach, the better. And that means the less sectarian we are, the better. The broader coalitions we build, the better. If we can bring in people we don't fully agree with, better. I mean, that's all I would say.
Thank you so much. If people don't have the book or haven't read it, I recommend you go get it. We tried to get the publisher to sell books here, and apparently you need like a month's heads-up notice to do that. So we didn't have enough time, unfortunately. But I hope everybody will pick up this book, because it's just a treasure house of information and it's really a really special book. So we think the best thing to do for questions is for people to line up at that mic, just so it could be fair, people from the top and people sitting. If you all want to get in line there, and we're going to ask a few questions, and then when you're ready, you can say, okay, and then answer them, and then we'll go, so maybe 3 at a time, and then Dr. Khalidi will answer. And we have till, are you good for another little bit? 35 minutes. Yeah, until 7.
Hello. Okay. Hi, good evening. First of all, thank you so much for speaking with us. My question is, which theorists or historians have had the greatest influence on you as a scholar, either in your historical worldview or in your methodology? Thank you.
I know that historians don't know about the future, but given that most people don't vote based on foreign policy, in your opinion, what would it take for the United States to back away from the Israel project, short of the fall of the US empire?
I'm wondering what news sources for you have been the most useful and the ones you look at the most frequently. And I also want to say that I understand that may not mean you believe the things you are reading, but where you look to gather your news.
Let me take those three. Sure. Okay, let me take those three first. These are hard questions. What historians had the most influence on me? I mean, I would have to start with one of my mentors, or my main mentor, who taught me when I was a graduate student, a historian by the name of Albert Hourani. I almost immediately departed from his approach and wrote very differently than he had, but he had an enormous influence on me, as did a couple of the other people who taught me when I was a graduate student. One of them was a woman by the name of Agatha Ram, who was Agatha Ram, R-A-M-M. Nobody up here would ever have heard of her. She was a diplomatic historian, and she taught me to read very carefully. She was having me read diplomatic documents, but everything you read, you should read very, very carefully. And that was she and Albert also taught me to do that, but she did it, she more than anyone else. I mean, I've been influenced by many, many other historians, Fernand Braudel, Christopher Hill, Eric Hobsbawm, not just left historians. I mean, a whole range of historians have influenced me. I could go on and on. What would it take for the United States to back away from the Israeli project? Well, it would take the American people taking, control and taking things into their own hands and wresting it away from an unrepresentative Mandarin elite of a foreign policy blob that controls everything, irrespective of which administration is in office, and who fail upwards. I promise you Blinken will fail upwards, Sullivan will fail upwards, people who have utterly failed in everything they've done in this war. I promise you they're going to go on to glittering, successful careers. The blob never betrays its own. It would take our what have I done?
You didn't do anything, it's touchy.
Yeah, it is touchy. It would take our being able to wrest control of this war away from the warmongers. And it has happened in the past. It happened over the Iraq War, it happened over the Vietnam War. It took a very long time. And it took ingenious forms of protest. It took convincing people who were hard to convince. I don't know how long it will take us. I don't know what the means to do that are. But it could happen. And it's not just stopping this war. It's changing the whole narrative. It means getting people to understand that the way in which they've always understood this is false. There are some people who will never change. They have a reading of this that's rooted in the Bible, or they have a reading of this that's rooted in something else that they've learned. The movie Exodus has convinced an entire generation of people who are in their 60s, 70s, that's what really happened in Palestine. We have to devise another narrative, and that may be through art, that may be through cinema, that may be through theater, that may be through novels or poetry. It won't just be through, political activism. And it's happening. The number of books being published on Palestine, you cannot count anymore. The number of memoirs, the numbers of books of poetry, the number of novels, the number of political tracts, the number of scholarly works is exploding. I can't keep track. I can't keep my bibliography up to date. And that's a good sign. And that's one of multiple fronts on which this is going to have to be waged in order to force the United States to back away from Israel. And that's not going to be easy, but it can be done. And frankly, I believe that what Israel is doing facilitates it. I think that the behavior, especially of this leadership, has alienated ordinary people to the extent that there's an opening to push much harder than people are pushing right now. Last question, sources. I mean, a lot of the sources that I use are just the ordinary sources, but I read them against the grain. I don't take the New York Times, I don't swallow the poison along with whatever there is in that newspaper. I read the Israeli media obsessively. There's an enormous amount in it. I don't agree with the line of Haaretz. I certainly don't agree with the line of Yediot or the Times of Israel, or, God help us, the Jerusalem Post. But they're full of stuff, which if you read it carefully, gives you access to a lot of information. I read Arab sources. I read some of them in Arabic. I read some of them that are available, that are condensed in feeds that I get. I follow some of that stuff through Al Jazeera, the online app. They've just shut down their office in the West Bank, in Ramallah. Part of the success of the Zionist project is leaving us eyeless in Gaza, by preventing journalists from being in Gaza, by killing 171 Palestinian journalists in Gaza, by shutting down the Jazeera office in Jerusalem, and now the Jazeera office. They're trying to make us eyeless in Gaza. That is a core objective, so that everything is filtered through Admiral Hagari and Admiral Kirby and whoever the admiral at the New York Times who writes these appalling headlines. They want us only to get a drip of poison with every piece of information that they put out. And getting around that is a very hard thing to do, but you can do it.
Is that it seems like the United States is really undermining its status as a superpower, really with every day that it lets itself be pushed around by what is, on paper, an ally or a client or whatever you want to call it. And simultaneously, the Democratic Party is, as you said, like totally alienating its base. So is this a miscalculation, or do you think that the blob that you mentioned really has a different understanding of like what it means to maintain superpower status?
Yeah. Couple more.
Thank you again for speaking, Rashid. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what you said about like the disunity of like strategy in Palestine and the disunity in general. Do you see like in the near term like some kind of strategic coherence or some kind of effective resistance like forming? And also, I guess both in Palestine and both internationally, what role? I think I've been very encouraged by labor, at least in the U.S., and how they've responded. And like, what role do you think labor will play in ending this war?
Maybe one more?
Thank you. I want to pick up on the question the guy just before me asked. What's in your understanding, the imperial motivation here? When we talk about U.S. imperialism in Latin America or in Vietnam or elsewhere around the world historically, we can single out political, economic, strategic objectives. Why tolerate, enable, arm a settler colonial state when in fact you're surrounded by comprador Arab regimes that kind of do your bidding anyway? What's the big objective?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I actually agree. The first question is sort of linked to the third question. I agree. I think the United States has facilitated the erosion of its position as an imperial power by its incredible mismanagement of this war. I cannot see how this is in any conceivable interest of the elites that own our country. They have acted in a way that to me is irrational. And I think the United States has significantly undermined its status, at least in the Middle East. I'm not qualified to talk about the world as a whole, though I think that what's happening in the Middle East has seriously eroded the position in the Middle East of the United States in the world as a whole, but it's certainly eroded the position of the United States in the Middle East. It's weakened client governments. It's emboldened all forms of hostility to the United States and to Israel, enhanced them and fortified them in ways that can't possibly be welcome in Washington. And it has put Israel on a path that is, to my way of thinking, suicidal in terms of Zionist interests. I'm not talking about killing Palestinians or the death of Israelis. I'm talking about the project. I cannot see how what they're doing helps the project. And even if we go back to the third question and you say somehow the continuation of this settler colonial project is seen as in the interest of the elites in Washington and on Wall Street, I cannot see how encouraging them to continue with this insane war helps that project's survival. I can't see it. So I really think that this has been mismanaged, even in their terms. But certainly, I think that the United States has severely harmed its standing by everything it's done to reinforce Israel's trampling all over international humanitarian law and slaughtering people in the way that it has. I'm also encouraged by the labor movement thus far. I think that it has done, in many unions have been remarkably and courageously outspoken about the war, in spite of the pressures from the Democratic Party leadership, in spite of the pressures from some traditional labor leaderships. And I think that's a really great thing. My predictions about Palestinian strategy developing. I don't know. I mean, the way I escape from answering questions like this usually is to say that the job description of a historian doesn't include predicting the future. I mean, I hope and pray that out of this awful horror, some kind of consensus on a rational strategy for the Palestinians will emerge. I know that there's a generation of young people who are ready to step into the shoes of their elders all over Palestine. I'm not sure that this war is going to facilitate that in some respects. I think it may in some others. It's hard to say. I really can't say. It is certainly the case that this externally supported quisling leadership in Ramallah is ripe for removal and toppling and replacement. But when and if that can happen, I really don't know. They're very strongly supported by external forces, notably the United States and Israel. And it's hard to see how that can change. And that's part of the problem with the strategy. I also have a critique. If you're interested, you can read my interview with Tariq Ali in New Left Review. I also have a critique of the Hamas leadership in terms of strategy. And so I think that this division between various Palestinian movements and what I see as the absence of a long-term strategy is something that has to be overcome. I don't know if it will be. I hope it will be. The last question about imperial motivation. I think one of the motivations is a desire for 360-degree dominance. And having a powerful, unchained proxy like Israel, I think serves that interest. I mean, if you see the glee with which government spokespersons have reacted to the killing of Ibrahim Aqil, who was a military commander in Hamas, who was one of 40 people or 50 people, 30 or 40 of whom were civilians, who were killed in an airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut 2 days ago. Brett McGurk, former American ambassador to Beirut, Sullivan, the national security advisor, have all expressed their glee at the fact this fellow was killed because he supposedly had a hand in the American embassy bombing and the Marine barracks bombings of 1983. I think that's an example of how people in Washington, in this foreign policy elite, see Israel's value to the United States. Let me say as a footnote, having been someone who lived in Beirut before and during those events, that one of the reasons that American Marines and the American embassy was targeted was that Lebanese held it against the United States that it had given the green light for Israel's invasion, which killed 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, and led to the occupation and devastation of Lebanon, an occupation which continued until 2020. A lot of Lebanese deeply resented the slaughter of 20,000 of their fellow citizens. They deeply resented the fact that the United States had armed that intervention. They deeply resented that the United States had forced the PLO out of Lebanon. They deeply resented the fact that the United States had installed a puppet government in Beirut to do American and Israeli bidding. They deeply resented a number of other things. And that was perhaps one of the reasons that these bombings that led to the killing of many Americans, many American Marines, many French paratroopers, and many American embassy and Central Intelligence Agency personnel took place. That history is never mentioned. All we hear is that this man was involved. He was about 20 when this happened, by the way, in 1983. We never hear why Lebanese might have done such a thing. We never hear about the 20,000 people slaughtered by Israel, over 80% of whom were civilians, in a war that the United States gave the green light to. Read chapter 5 of my book.
I was going to ask if you think the U.S. is a rational actor, but someone already asked that. But I'll say in the context of Israel, you know, if its goal is, as it states, to defeat Hamas, get the hostages home, maybe it's not acting in accordance with its goals. But if its goal is genocide, do you think it's rational? And what conclusions can we base in our organizing tactics based on that conclusion?
I have two related questions. I know we're short on time, so you can answer one or both. The first one is about the Camp David Accords. They were, I think, in my view, a major setback. A major setback for the Palestinian movement, and I wonder if there were realistic chances for statehood after that agreement. And second related question is, when you were taking part in the negotiations in the early 90s, what was your mindset or your goals for those negotiations? Were you optimistic that an agreement would be reached? Were you more pessimistic? What was your thinking?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you again for being here today. I'm curious how much you see it reasonable for those of us who are interested in how much you see it being reasonable for those of us who are interested in Palestinian statehood to turn to the self-described Israeli activists currently working against their own government as allies in that movement.
Interesting. And then you received a note. It's not a language I understand.
It's in Arabic. I don't have my glasses.
You won't be able to answer
I can't read it. Are these just magnifying glasses? Oh, yeah, that helps. No, he's just asking me to get in touch with him. Whoa! I'm really sorry about that. I'm not trying to do that. Okay. The first question was about if Israel claims or states that its objective is to defeat Hamas and to release the hostages, is that really their objective, and how are they going to achieve that? And if not, what are their real objectives? It seems crystal clear, and you get this from just reading the Israeli press. You don't need to have a crystal ball or any particular skill to see that the current Israeli government doesn't give a hoot in hell about the hostages. It would be happy to have them all die. And it will not do what is necessary to get them released, which is to have a ceasefire in Gaza. That could have happened 9 months ago, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago. They do not give a damn about the hostages. They also know, at least the military knows. The politicians may be too stupid to know and ignorant, but the military knows that there's no such thing as defeating Hamas. It's physically impossible. You can win tactical victories over Hamas. You can eliminate some of their military formations. You can loosen their grip on power in the Gaza Strip. You can't defeat Hamas. Hamas is a pan-Palestinian movement. Hamas is a political, religious, ideological force. You can defeat a battalion or a company in the field. You can't defeat an ideology, an idea, a politico-ideological religious formation. That's absurd. And almost every sane Israeli general and security official who's said anything about this has recognized that. This is an illusory objective. It's a carrot held before the nose of Israelis so that they continue to sacrifice their sons and daughters on the altar of the real objectives, which have nothing to do with the hostages and nothing to do with defeating Hamas, destroying Hamas. I mean, you can, as I say, you can defeat Hamas militarily, but as a wise man once said, a guerrilla force wins just by not losing. A conventional army loses if it doesn't win. And this is a conventional army that in this sense cannot win, and a non-conventional force which in this sense cannot lose. So you cannot destroy Hamas. That individual was Henry Kissinger. I'm quoting Kissinger again. The real objective is completing the project, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the elimination of as many Palestinians and the taking over as much land as possible. And if they're able to do it, they would eliminate the population of Gaza, expelling them ideally or killing as many of them as possible. They've made life impossible in Gaza. This has nothing to do with military objectives like an alleged command post hidden behind human shields. You kill 50 or 80 people to kill one Hamas leader. This has to do with making Gaza unlivable. You don't destroy water purification plants, every single one of them. You don't destroy sewage treatment plants, every single one of them. You don't destroy the entire electrical grid, all of it. You don't destroy the entire internet system, in its entirety, to get at a military. You do that to make life unlivable and to have people die of disease and hunger and thirst. And that's the objective. That's the objective. It's an even more bloody and much more violent form of what has happened again and again and again in Palestine. That's the objective of this government, and it will continue to be their objective until they're stopped. Camp David. Yeah, Camp David was an enormous setback for the Palestinians. I've already said that. I don't want to say much more about it. Was achieving Palestinian statehood possible? Yeah, perhaps if the Intifada had continued, if it had not been stopped, partly because the Palestinian leadership thought that it could achieve something by negotiation at that point. Again, that goes back to one of the earlier questions. It's not this or that, it's this and that, and this and the other. Continue to boycott, continue to strike, continue to put pressure, don't concede, carry out public diplomacy, carry out propaganda, resist, and negotiate. And that's what the PLO leadership didn't do. They said, we've reached the promised land because they let them sit at the table. Well, they hadn't reached the promised land. They'd reached a Bantustan. That's what they got, or glorified set of Bantustans. What was my mindset? I was wrong in assuming that it was possible, given the strategy of the PLO, to get more than they ended up getting. I realized that very soon. I actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on the day that they signed this ill-fated agreement on the White House lawn, in which I said, I don't think this is going to work. So I had figured it out by 1993, but when I went into this, I was deluded. One of my students, Seth Anziska, has since written a book in which he shows exactly why it was impossible. It's called Preventing Palestine. You would do well to read it. Yeah. I'm forgetting what the last question was. How reasonable. I started taking notes and I didn't finish.
Rational actor?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I actually think that I actually think that both the actions of the United States and the actions of Israel are not necessarily the actions of rational actors. There is a kind of rationale, which is summed up in something that I put in the afterword to the British edition of The 100 Years' War, which was just recently published in the UK, in which I said that there's an Israeli dictum: if force doesn't work, use more force. And that's the rationale behind this. And it is irrational to believe that after hundreds, perhaps thousands of assassinations, assassinating another one or two or three or four leaders of Hamas or Hezbollah will change anything. The people who blew up the US Embassy and the Marine Barracks in 1983 were 20 years old when they did that. Imad Mughniya, allegedly, I don't know that this is true, and the man who was killed 2 days ago, Brahim Aqil, were supposedly the young men who blew up the embassy and blew up the Marine Barracks. If that's true, we're talking about people who had lived through years and years and years of Israeli bombardment of South Lebanon. They came from South Lebanon. and one of whom had been wounded fighting the Israelis, and both of whom had lost family members. What Israel is doing is producing people who in 10 or 15 years will do what these guys did. They did it to Marines and to our embassy in Beirut. I know people who suffered as a result of that. Some of my colleagues at the American University of Beirut were killed, including the president, Malcolm Kerr, and including two of my colleagues in the department I was in at the American University. So I'm no fan of what was done. I'm just saying this produces that, necessarily and inevitably. What Israel is doing is going to produce a similar that. That is not rational. There is a rationale behind it, but it's not rational. And the United States supporting Israel in doing these things has a rationale. It is not rational. It's not rational in terms of morality. It's not rational in terms of our values. It's not even rational in terms of imperial logic, I would argue. But they don't seem to be able to see that. They are, as we are, because they've prevented journalists from going there, we are all eyeless in Gaza. Thank you.